Movies and TV have made life in a castle look like an episode of MTV Cribs, provided you're one of the nobles, but it wasn't all feasts and festivals. Castles were dark, dank, smelly fortresses loaded with vermin and disease. Today we're exploring what life was really like in a medieval castle. If you were one of the lucky ruling class, you got to indulge in rich wine and the occasional hot bath. For the most part, there wasn't much comfort or relaxation to be found outside of going to church and torturing an enemy to death. For Europeans in medieval times, plumbing was a distant dream, which means there was no such thing as running water and absolutely no way to flush the toilet. Waste just collected in a big pool beneath the toilets, essentially making every castle a giant porta-potty. Now picture that porta-potty on the hottest day of the summer. Maybe that's why everyone in Game of Thrones is so angry all the time. And it wasn't just the perpetual stench of feces making castle life stinky. No running water means no baths, unless you were super rich. So all the servants in a castle were running around smelling as ripe as my old gym bag. On top of that, the servants couldn't afford medicine, like lords and nobles could. So your average castle dweller was wandering around, intensely ill and trying to make do with home remedies or praying God it would go away. And hey, speaking of those toilets, privacy wasn't really a thing in castles unless you owned the place. So when you had to run off into the bathroom to do your necessities, you'd be doing it on a long wooden bench with several holes cut into it in full view of your friends, co-workers, and really anyone else who happened to walk by. Again, there was no flushing, so your business would just drop down into a gigantic pit of horrors inside the castle, and let's hope you never accidentally dropped your wagon keys in there. Because you might as well be throwing it into a septic volcano. You know how cramped the house gets when one or two relatives come to visit. Castles required dozens of servants just to maintain the day-to-day workings, not to mention the several generations of the lord and lady's families living there and all of their personal servants in attendance. It was like living in a tiny, cramped city, all serving the needs of a single family. We've all seen enough fantasy films and Disney cartoons to know that castles had dungeons where the lord and lady could throw criminals, political opponents, or really anyone in. Rats were everywhere in a castle, and there really wasn't much you could do about them. You just sort of accepted rat infestation as a part of normal life, kind of like the Chevy Malibu of the day. After a while, you would imagine people would get used to the rats, but many medieval folks were deathly afraid of them. It certainly didn't help that they were a popular instrument of torture or that around this time, they carried a plague that eradicated around half the population of Europe. At this point, it should come as no surprise that castle-dwelling folk liked to stay sauced. Because the best way to get through a day inside an overcrowded, poo-smelling house of rat torture was with a mug of ale firmly in hand. The lords and ladies got to drink pretty much whatever they wanted, including fine wines, beers, and spirits. But the servants, they had to take what they could get. It was actually safer to drink alcohol than water, because most water you could find would be so contaminated, the TSA would confiscate it as a weapon. With all that drinking going on, you'd assume that most people in a castle wouldn't drag themselves out of bed until at least noon. Electricity obviously didn't exist yet, so sunlight was crucially important. Castles are dark places, even during the day, so the servants had to capitalize on every second of sunlight, just to get their work done. Basically, wherever you went in the castle, you were walking on a layer of barely concealed filth. In the time before microwaves, George Foreman grills, and sur la table, all cooking was done over open flames, which could be a problem if you're cooking in a building full of timber and hay. In the first half of the Middle Ages, most kitchens were built out of wood for reasons that history has not yet adequately explained. Consequently, your entire kitchen catching fire over a stray ember from today's lunch service was a constant possibility. Everyone and everything were flame-broiled, It wasn't until later that stone became the building material of choice and hearths were constructed to keep cooking fires contained. Look at that poor person, so gross. The Middle Ages were tough, so much so that even the best-case scenario of living in a castle was pretty much a miserable experience. How would you like it in a castle?